Hello, students, and welcome back. It is time for the next part of our chapter or our unit on the Pacific theater of war in World War II. And I've got my book now in front of me, but I'll also put it up on the screen so you can follow along there. 7.3, we're starting on page 207 of our textbook, Cause and Effects of 20th Century Wars. So let me jump in and share, and we'll get going. Not sure how long this one is going to take. It's not a very long section, 7.3. I might just stop it just so it's easily compartmentalized, or I might just keep going into 7.4. Okay, so 7.2 is where we just were. Let me make this bigger for me, hopefully for you as well. Okay, 7.3, strategy and tactics. So first of all, we should talk about strategy and tactics. What are they? Um, Strategy means the plan. Of course, we talked about the Schlieffen Plan in World War One. Tactics are uh, what you do to achieve a goal. How do you go about? Do you fight from the air? Do you fight from boats? Do you fight from the land? Do you do guerrilla style warfare? Do you, all kinds of different ways of fighting? And that is tactics. Okay. So the first questions it has, key questions here. What influence did geography have on strategy? So obviously the geography that we're going to get to when we look at this big map on the next page is we have a lot of ocean, right? Japan is a series, as you know, because you live here, of four islands and disconnected from the rest of the Asian continent by water. And everywhere they wanted to go and attack, they had to get there by boat. They could obviously fly to a limited extent back then, but if you wanted to, move a lot of materials and a lot of men, they went by boat, and it takes a little while. It takes a while to get, say, from Japan out to Midway or Oahu, which is where Hawaii is, and Pearl Harbor. And of course, over here, if we kept going on this map, would be California and the United States. But the Pacific Ocean is very, very large, and that obviously had an effect on the strategy. Okay, and then, they've attacked in 1937, as you know, Marco Polo Bridge, the Second Sino-Japanese War starts, and they've attacked China. But China is this massive country that they really only occupy the coastal areas of. They don't go too far into the country. They don't really go up here toward Russia. They try at one point, and Russia kicks their butt. They're like, we're not going to do that again. They take over Korea right here. I know this is, it should be this way, but this is the way it is in the book. Uh, and then, of course, they take over Manchuria and call it Manchukuo. You know all about that. And they have different names for some of these countries now. Siam is Thailand, and Burma is Bangladesh, and Myanmar, and Indochina is Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia. So not all of these countries are still called these names, but you get the basic idea. Okay, so we need to talk about that. How did geography influence how they were going to go about fighting the war on both sides? Because the what you'll find out is the Allied forces had this interesting strategy that worked well for them in the second part of the war, when they started to recover, called island hopping. Okay, so we're going to look at that as a strategy based on geography. What were the relative strengths and weaknesses of Allied and Japanese strategy? So what did they have? What ideas did they have that were good? What ideas did they have that were not so good on both sides? And what role did strategy play in who won and who lost and the outcome of the war? All right, and then of course we have our IB concepts: cause, what caused things to happen; consequence, what were the results; and how significant were some of these decisions along the way. Okay, Japanese war plans. Understanding the industrial might and thus military potential of the U.S., comma, Japanese strategists developed essentially a defensive strategy. So they knew that the United States would come back after the attack on Pearl Harbor strong. Okay, they thought it would take them a while, but of course, again, they didn't get the aircraft carriers when they hit Pearl, so that allowed the Americans to come back much quicker. They also didn't take out the oil reserves at Pearl, so they had a lot of oil to fuel their boats. That they should have blown up if they had really done everything they could have done when they attacked Pearl Harbor. Uh, so uh, they knew that industrially they could produce a lot of stuff. They had a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, a lot of factories, and the military potential was there, right? If they decided to go all out, they knew that they would not be no match for the United States at full power. So they decided to be a little defensive. Okay. So they had an initial period of offensive operations, attacking, attacking, attacking. Okay. And that would extend the strategic perimeter of Island Basin eastward in the Pacific, southward into Malaya, which is now Malaysia, and Indonesia. Okay. And like I said, if you go back again to this map, this red line is the kind of like as far as it got. Okay. So if we look at the key, uh, Japanese controlled territory prior to 7 December 1941 is this other smaller line. Okay, that's what they had before they attacked Pearl Harbor. And after that, they picked up the Philippines, Siam. They attacked New Guinea. They attacked some small islands out here, the Marshall Islands, some Solomon Islands down here. There's a big battle at Guadalcanal. There's a battle at the Coral Sea, etc. Okay, but this is kind of the perimeter, the limits of the Japanese conquest, June of 1942. So that's as big as it got. And of course, June of 1942, um, this is a mistake on the map, and I think I'll point this out, of course, in class as well. You need to scratch this out, and hopefully in your current textbook, because mine's kind of old, they might have fixed it. It says 4-6 June 1941. Well, that's of course impossible for that to be the Battle of Midway because December 7th, 1941 is Pearl Harbor, and that's the first attack. This is supposed to say 1942. So the Battle of Midway is the turning point. After that, Japan is definitely on the defensive for for the next 2 years, the summer of 1942 to the summer of 1944. That's when D-Day happens and the war starts to end in Europe. Japan definitely knows it only has about a year left, and of course, the war does end in 1945, and we'll get to and it starts to shrink back toward the main islands of Japan. This perimeter starts to shrink, and they never bust out again in any big way. Okay. Uh, so a period of fortifications would follow after they were expanding. Fortification means to build defensive forts and airfields and put men on islands and bases, during which the Japanese would reinforce the bases running from the Kuril Islands in the north, south through the Marshall Islands, west through New Guinea, around the East Indies, and then north again to Burma. So again, I keep going back to this map. I should have like taken a screenshot of it and turned it on its side. The Kuril Islands, are these ones above Hokkaido. Okay. So they start to fortify and they come all the way down here to Burma and they go over to uh, the Marshall Islands are way out here, out in the outer kind of perimeter of the Pacific. And so, they're just trying to like stake out their territory, right? Okay. Uh, According to the strategist, this perimeter would enclose the resources needed to sustain their empire. Okay, and I'm about right here on the page, right? Okay, sustain the empire. So they needed to make sure they had access to oil, to rubber, to certain foods, that they needed to feed the troops, all those kind of things, metals. That they could get, and they figured, if we can hold this perimeter, we have everything we need to kind of keep the war machine going. It would also necessarily widen the war still further by drawing Australia and probably New Zealand into the conflict. So they knew if they got that close to Australia, now you're starting to threaten their sovereignty. New Zealand, of course, and Australia are friends of Great Britain. And indeed, those troops did fight in World War I. We know how much they were involved in that war, and they fought again in World War II. Should the US still be fighting by that point, a war of attrition? So, this is the big idea on the Japanese side. Should the US still be fighting by that point, a war of attrition was planned, eventually forcing the US to the negotiating table. This was the Japanese idea. They never thought that they could, quote unquote, win the war, beat the United States, but they figured they could do enough damage, take enough territory, and then say, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, let's look at what's going on here, United States, and try to negotiate and say, okay, we'll give you back this. You can, we'll give up this, we'll pull back here, but we want to keep this, we want to do this, and let's come to an agreement. Okay, some kind of amiable, I can't say that word. Agreed upon peace. Okay, but no, that's not the way it was going to go. Okay. And of course, there were some in the Japanese higher command who thought the Americans had no fight in them. They had been isolationists. They hadn't gotten involved when Hitler started attacking people in Europe, and they thought that they were cowards or not interested in fighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They had no Bushido, they had no code, et cetera. So they thought that they would quickly agree to terms or come to a negotiating table and talk it out and work out things through diplomacy. But that was not going to be the case. But that was the big Japanese idea. Okay. It wasn't to crush the Americans at Pearl Harbor or, completely destroy them, or they were never going to invade California. They didn't have world domination plans like Hitler eventually did. Hitler at some point talked about, really controlling all of Europe and kind of the world in some of his crazier ideas. Japan never wanted to do that. They wanted the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, that famous thing we've talked about. They wanted to be in charge of Asia. They wanted to be in charge of China, in charge of Vietnam, in charge of the Philippines, obviously in charge of Korea, and be the big wig Asians that everybody would have to come to trade with that region of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And that was their goal. It wasn't to take over the United States or defeat the United States in totality like that. Okay. As the Allied war effort gained momentum, the initial perimeter could not be maintained, and by mid-1943, so about a year after Midway, a year and a half after Pearl Harbor, it had to be reevaluated and in fact shrunk. Okay, so it starts to shrink the perimeter. By the spring of 1945, the perimeter that the Japanese High Command thought that it could realistically defend was reduced further to a line narrowly drawn around the islands immediately surrounding the home islands of Honshu and Shikoku and Kyushu and Hokkaido. Okay? So they wanted to be defensive, but they thought they could hold off the attack in the advance, and they just couldn't. And a lot of it wasn't necessarily to do with bravery or anything on the part or even good tactics, as we're going to find out. It's to do with simple supply and demand sometimes, in the sense of they have limited manpower, right? Where how they can't immediately replace a lot of these soldiers that are dying. They have limited supplies. They have a long way to go to get those supplies to where they need to be. And they don't have any allies in this fight. They are allied in the Axis Power Alliance, if you want to call it that, with Germany and Italy, but they're off fighting their own war on the other side of the globe. So the Japanese are all alone in the Pacific trying to do this. They don't have, the Americans get help from the British, from the Australians, from the Canadians, from other allied powers, obviously in Europe, but of course in the Pacific as well. Okay. Such a plan would require close cooperation between the Japanese Army and Navy. Okay, once again, the Army, I'm down here now, Army and Navy. The Army, land, Navy, boats. Okay, so we've talked before about how these two groups, one led by Hideki Tojo and the other one led by Admiral Yamamoto, who tragically for the Japanese dies, I think, in 43. We'll find out in a minute. I can't remember the exact date. Um, but they don't get along. Okay, they're arguing all the time who's more important, who should take first precedence in this, blah 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 blah. And if they had worked together more seamlessly, they might have had more success in some of these battles, but we'll get into that. This coordination had been part of the Japanese operational doctrine for some time, and joint training was common. The relatively new technology of the aircraft carrier, however, would make the war in the Pacific like no other naval conflict in history. Okay, I think we've talked about this. This is the first time you've ever had a battle um, where you've got boats. Okay, normally in the old days, boats would have to get right up next to each other practically and fire cannons at each other. And then, the weapons got a little better and they could be a little further apart. But normally they had to sight the other boat. Oh, the boat's over there, and okay, and steer and turn the boat toward it or turn it to the side so the guns could fire and all this kind of thing. Now you've got these big aircraft carriers that have many, many planes on them. I'm not sure how many planes one of these World War II era aircraft carriers held, but it was many dozen. I don't know if it would be 100, maybe it was 75. I'm not sure, but it was a lot. Okay, and they would take off, go fly their mission, come back, land, go down. They had elevators and stuff, and then the new ones would come up. They had various weapons. Some of them were dive bombers. Some of them dropped torpedoes, torpedo bombers. Some of them were just fighter planes that protected the other planes or the other boats that were around. And they would have battles. They had battles in World War II in the Pacific where this aircraft carrier or these two aircraft carriers were here, and it might be 600 kilometers away was the other aircraft carrier. They would both have their planes take off, fight, and then go back. The ones that survived would go back, and the boats itself would never see each other, and there was no land involved at all, no fighting with guys with guns, poo poo. So it was unlike anything that had ever happened before in warfare in all of human history. The Japanese were really, let me go back here. Uh, they were early adopters, as it says in our chapter. So what does that mean? That means they had adopted this technology and this idea of a new style of warfare very early. Okay, they knew, I think, being an island nation, that they needed to have a strong navy, and it had worked for them. They had won the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905 on the strength of their navy, and it made them very proud. And they had a strong history of having a good navy from that point on. They didn't really need to, fight in World War One. They were involved a little bit, but they weren't really in any big fight. Um, and then, a lot of what happened with Manchuria, Mukden, and Manchukuo, and then the Second Sino-Japanese War, that was all mostly army stuff. Uh, and maybe some airplanes as well, but not so much Navy. So World War II was really the chance for the Navy to shine and be a decisive factor in their victory and or their defeat. Admiral Yamamoto saw in the aircraft carrier and its planes a long-range extension of the fleet's firepower. The aircraft carriers and their crew were the elite of the Japanese Imperial Navy, and considerable time and resources had been poured into their construction. Okay, I'm right here at the top of 208, and into refining their operation. By 7 December 1941, famous date you need to know, the operational distance for carrier-borne aircraft was about 300 kilometers. So that's what I said. You could have guys, two boats, 600 kilometers apart. Their planes would take off, fight for so many minutes in the air, shoot down other planes, and then turn around and go back. And they could fly all that distance and have a battle and then come back. Aircraft navigation was still rudimentary. Rudimentary means at a basic level. Hadn't got really sophisticated yet. You got to remember radar and sonar are like new technology in World War II. Uh, so it was rudimentary in the first years of the war for one and two seat planes, limiting safe long range operation to relatively clear days. So weather was an important part. Okay. And we're going to see this when we watch the Midway movie, how much weather impacts their ability to see what's happening, to look out of their planes and see what's happening down on the sea. And yeah, these planes were all small little airplanes that held one or two guys. Usually, the guy in the front was the pilot, the guy in the back was maybe the navigator and or the gunner who had a gun and could shoot at other planes attacking their plane. And you'll again see that when we watch the movie. Okay. Of course, they had other bigger planes, and we'll get to those later. We had big bombers that dropped bombs, and those had bigger crews. Sometimes six guys, eight guys would be in the plane doing various jobs. And these were massive planes, but we're talking now mostly about smaller fighter jets. After their initial success in the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese land forces were primarily involved in defensive operations. The longer they had to strengthen these defenses, the stronger they became. Concrete pillboxes. A pillbox is like a small, you know what concrete is, made out of hard to, explode or shoot bullets into material. Would be like a small square uh, box, for lack of a better word, that you would dig into the ground and it would have a slit. And you could kind of, put the muzzle of the machine gun out and it would be kind of like a small rectangle so the gun could move back and forth. And they were very hard to attack, but they were very effective at shooting things. And we're going to see those in action when we watch uh, some footage from Saving Private Ryan and how they use those, the Germans use those pillboxes on the beaches of Normandy. Uh, they covered beaches with these concrete pillboxes, islands such as Iwo Jima, which you've heard of off the coast of Tokyo, were a warren. A warren means just many, many, many of tunnels and bunkers. So they dug tunnels into the sides of mountains so they could run in there if bombs were dropped. They could hide in there when the enemy came. And but they weren't. It wasn't just one tunnel. They were connected almost like by little tubes and passageways all throughout. In the latter stages of the war, these defenses would be defended until no defenders were left. So often they would die defending these defensive positions. They wouldn't surrender. They wouldn't come out. The American or the Allied troops would be outside saying, "Look, you're surrounded. There's nowhere to go. Just come out." And they would refuse, and they would have to throw in hand grenades and explode the tunnel or the bunker or use flamethrowers. And it was often a grisly end for some of these Japanese soldiers that refused to surrender. These tactics, okay, there's that word, were inspired by fierce loyalty and often, as on Saipan, including suicide attacks on U.S. units. Okay, and I think we already talked about the idea of a suicide attack, how this was sort of not something that American soldiers could conceive of, but the Japanese soldiers were so fiercely loyal to the emperor, to Japan, to doing their job and their duty that they would sacrifice themselves much more readily than any American soldier. An American soldier might have sacrificed himself, like jumped on a grenade to save his guys in his company, the guys in his unit, the guys that he knew by name and had gone through all the training together, and they were now like they were a small family in the army, doing this job. An American, I think, could conceive of that, giving up your life to save other lives immediately around you and people you knew. But the abstract notion of, running into uh, a camp with, dynamite strapped to you and then blowing yourself up or flying your plane into another plane knowing you're going to die was a little hard to get their mind around the American troops. They just couldn't understand that mentality. And, it was effective in limited ways for the Japanese, but I don't think they ever really did. It was a desperate effort by a defeated army when they decided to start sending out pilots, to fly into boats. And, a lot of them got shot down and never were effective at all. Okay, and then we get to this thing I just mentioned a few minutes ago called island hopping. And I think this video, well, yeah, we'll just do 7.3 because I'm talking a lot. Okay. Yamamoto's predicted year of success. Remember, he thought we're going to attack Pearl Harbor and we'll get about 1 year out of that before the Americans come back at us. So we'll have basically all of 1942, and then by 1943, they should be ready again. And it says right here in this first sentence that year only lasted 6 months. And by June of 1942, about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, is when they have Midway. And they didn't know at that point that that battle was going to go that way. But after the Americans blew up, I think three of the four aircraft carriers, the Japanese aircraft carriers that went into that battle, it really was the start of the end for the Japanese Navy. After a strategic defeat at Coral Sea, okay, which the Battle of Coral Sea was in May of 42, and a crushing defeat at Midway a month later in June of 42, the Japanese would now sit behind their defensive perimeter while the offensive initiative went over to the United States. So all the attacking was now coming from the Allies. The U.S. now had some decisions to make. Which route? How would it get there? Would it take toward the Japanese home islands? Should they move directly across the Central Pacific, populated with small garrison islands, or through the Southwest Pacific with its larger islands like the Philippines and Okinawa? Each route had its advantages and drawbacks. Domestic and inter-service politics would also play a role in the U.S. decision. Choosing the Central Pacific route would make the Navy the vital service, but it lacked enough land forces in 1942 to conquer and occupy the many little islands across the Central Pacific. It's one thing to take over an island, but then you got to leave guys behind to guard it and make sure nothing else happens. And if you build an airfield there, an airstrip for your planes to land, they got to guard it and make sure it doesn't get destroyed or blown up or, etc. The Army had sufficient manpower, but it did not get along with the Navy, which would have been now again this conflict between the Army and the Navy that I said existed in Japan also existed in the United States military, okay? Which would have which would have to play at least some role should the Southwest route be chosen. General Douglas MacArthur, very famous person, you need to know his name, was the senior U.S. military officer in the Pacific. The fact that he was politically connected with Roosevelt's opponents prompted the president to leave him in the Pacific. The Navy, however, was not interested in handing over command of its forces, which included the Marine Corps. Okay, we have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. The Marines are the guys that go in first on the land. Okay, to an Army officer, especially one with MacArthur's ego. So the Marine Corps is separate from the Army, and MacArthur is in charge of the Army, and the Navy doesn't want to let him be in charge of the Marine Corps. The decision was therefore taken to split the Pacific into two theaters of war. And now I'm down here, right? Two theaters of war. So, two areas, right? A theater is an area of war. Command of the Central Pacific Theater was given to Admiral Chester Nimitz, while MacArthur was given command of the Southwest Pacific Theater. And when we go to this map, in class, I can show you kind of more specifically where that is. Okay. By 1943, Nimitz was given command of the entire Pacific. So now Nimitz is an admiral, he's a Navy guy, and MacArthur is an Army guy. Together, they adopted a strategy that played on U.S. strength, air, and sea power while minimizing Japanese strength, strong defensive positions, and a willingness to defend them to the last man. The strategy would become known as island hopping. Okay, so instead of going somewhere where they knew there were Japanese troops there who were not going to surrender, who were going to fight to the end, they would just avoid those places and go to a different island nearby or something like that and defeat that island, maybe it had minimal or no forces, and use that as a base to then launch to the next area. And they would kind of checkerboard their way up toward Japan home islands, avoiding some of the more heavily defended places where the Japanese had left troops behind to slow down the American assault. U.S. invasion forces would bypass islands with stronger defenses and capture smaller islands. On these islands, they would build airstrips that would then allow them to bring air power to bear on the next island. Sorry, I'm not scrolling there. This system of overlapping air cover was to eventually get the U.S. forces close enough that heavy land-based bombers could initiate a strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home island. And this, of course, results in the very, very heavy bombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 that killed probably more people, probably 100,000 Japanese and a lot of civilians in that number over the course of 2 or 3 weeks of bombing, way more than were killed by either the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombs. So this ability to set up bases where they could take off and fly these big heavy bombers and drop their bombs and then fly back really was devastating for the home islands. The garrison islands that the Allies bypassed were of no strategic value without naval or air support. So, I mean, oops, imagine you've got this little island right here, okay? And you've got a bunch of Japanese guys. You're like, whoa, no one's going to get on this island or Guam. Let's just call it Guam. Let's say they took over Guam. Okay. Well, they would just say, okay, well, we'll just take our boat and go around Guam and go to Tinian, or we'll go to Saipan or some other place. And so all these guys in Guam, without their Japanese planes coming and landing there because they can't, because now the Americans are surrounding it, their boats aren't getting through to resupply them. They're just sitting there with nothing to do and nobody to attack, waiting to be of use, and they're stranded there with no boats or airplanes to come and help them out or bring them off the island, etc. So it was a pretty effective strategy, this thing called island hopping. Okay. All right, and then we get this big map. Okay, so now we're at the top of 210. Strategic bombing and commercial warfare. By 9 July 1944, so this is about a year before the war ends, the U.S. was able to begin putting the second component of their Pacific strategy into action. The capture of Saipan brought the Japanese home islands within range of the newest U.S. long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. So the B-29 is the name of a very large airplane that drops bombs. 2 months earlier, the Philippines had come within range of the heavy bombers. The U.S. believed that the B-29s could reduce much of Japan's urban areas, built as they were out of wood. You remember there's two types of bombs. You can drop a bomb that blows up things like concrete and buildings, or an incendiary bomb that drops and causes fires. And because so much of the Japanese homes and stuff back then in the 30s and 40s were built of wood, they would be very susceptible to fires. To reduce these cities, the U.S. would use incendiary bombs designed to start fires rather than high explosive designs to blast buildings. So I say things and then read the next sentence, and it's what I just explained, but that's okay. Um, yeah. Okay. Uh, the U.S. obviously tried to interrupt the shipping lines which the Japanese were getting their resources. They had American submarines that were shooting at Japanese supply boats. Um, and they weren't as good at defending against submarine attacks as the Americans were in the Atlantic against the German submarines. Okay. It talks a little bit in here, and we'll talk about this in class about MacArthur and Nimitz. We'll save that for in class. Also, this discussion question, to what extent was Japan more dependent on maritime commerce than the U.S. was. Maritime means at sea, so trading with other countries around Japan. How dependent were they on that compared to the United States? We'll talk about that. Okay, fighting in the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is over 160 million square kilometers in size. Obviously, the biggest of the five oceans on the planet, an immense, immense, immense amount of water. Uh, and you can fly for hours and not see any land when you're flying over the Pacific. To say that locating enemy ships in such a vast expanse is a challenge is an understatement, beyond words. Naval warfare until this point in history had been confined to areas relatively close to land. Okay. This had much to do with the fact that for much of its history of naval warfare, enemies generally occupied the same continent, and when they did not, as in the case of Rome and Carthage, the intervening body of water is relatively small and congested. So they're going way back in history to when, like, a place in Italy fought a place in Africa, and of course, the amount of the Mediterranean Sea was felt big back then to those people, but it's tiny when you compare it to the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. Okay. Uh, the Pacific Ocean, very, very big. This was the reason that the aircraft carrier became the indispensable weapon in the Pacific War. While battleships had to generally get within 20 kilometers of each other before they could start pounding each other with their big guns, aircraft carriers could carry on operations against the enemy at a distance of 200 kilometers. The vast distances also placed a premium on reliable long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Okay, so reconnaissance, as you know, are the aircraft that go out and look for things. They don't necessarily have as much weight on the plane. They're not carrying as many weapons, so they can hold more fuel. And they're just going out and searching for things and reporting back. Okay, and that's going to be a key part of Midway. You'll see when we watch the movie, like what the reconnaissance planes are able to tell people what's going on. Okay, here is one of the bombers. Okay, down in the picture. It's called a Lockheed Lightning. A Lockheed is an aircraft carrier maker like Boeing. Um, did the Allies have a technological advantage over the Japanese in the Pacific War? We need to talk about that in class. Okay. All right. And then the last page here, just to wrap it up here for this video. This top part, it says any land operations undertaken by either Japan or the Allies would entail amphibious landings. Okay, we've talked about this word before, amphibious, and like amphibian, like a frog, something that can exist on the land and in the water. So amphibious landings were notoriously difficult enterprises. So you've got to get the guys off the boats and from the boats to the shore. They've got to come up to the beaches so they can get out and start fighting. And you can drop them out of planes and they have parachutes, but that's not going to work for large, large numbers. And this is what we're going to see in D-Day when we watch the Saving Private Ryan footage. Um, you're going to see, they had to swing that door open at the front, and then the bullets would come in, and the guys would have to try to get out. Some parts of the beaches it was better, other parts it was devastation right off the bat. In the scene we watch with Tom Hanks, they all have to jump off over the side into the water because they're just getting, shot and shot and shot because of the angle the Germans have on them. And this is true too when you're going to get off of a boat, and you want to go and attack Iwo Jima, and the guys have to come to shore. And of course, the guys that are already on the land, the Japanese in this case, have their guns trained on that beach. And when you get off, you have to be able to get your troops there, and it's very difficult. Landing troops were incredibly vulnerable until they landed, and then moderately so until they established a secure beachhead. Command of the air was essential for a successful amphibious operation. And this is that sentence right here is the whole reason. I know it's not really cooperating. That Hitler gave up on the Battle of Britain and went off and did Operation Barbarossa and attacked Russia instead. He couldn't get sufficient command of the air over the English Channel to allow, knowing that his boats of German troops that he wanted to land on English soil and attack London and attack other parts of England would be successful because the planes could come along and just drop bombs on the boats and riddle them with bullets, and they would have never been safe. And you can see a little bit of that if you watch the Dunkirk movie that Yuki talked about. Okay, so you had to have command of the air, and so it made it very difficult to do amphibious landings without that. The supply ships and troop transports were exposed to attack while they supported the landings and while supplying the offensive as it moved inland. So you've got these boats just kind of offshore a little bit, and they've just got to kind of wait around because they've got all the supplies. You got to wait for the guys to get on the beach. Then they got to unload everything and take it to the beach. And these troop transports, if a Japanese plane came by and shot it up or dropped bombs or dropped a torpedo, they could get blown up just waiting around to do their job. So it was very difficult um, uh, strategy of amphibious landings. Okay, and then the last part, we get a little technology box that you guys are familiar with about aircraft carriers. So I'll let you kind of read that yourself. Here's a few things I highlighted in my book. It says by the 1930s, all major maritime powers had some form of aircraft carrier. So any country like England that had a big empire and they had a big navy, or Germany, had some aircraft carriers. Now, Germany did almost no fighting in the sea in World War II, except for their submarines. Okay, they had some battleships and stuff like that, but they didn't really use them that much in World War II. But a lot of the big powers had aircraft carriers, and of course the Americans and Japanese did as well. Okay, and it tells you why they made sense. It says uh, the Battle of the Coral Sea early in the Pacific War became the first battle in history in which the opposing surface fleets, okay, the boats on the water, never saw each other during the battle. They just let their planes take off and go and fight each other in the air while they sat around and waited for them to come back and report back, etc., and then send the next wave. Nevertheless, adopting the new technology did not come easily to senior staff who have been trained to believe that the battleship, remember we talked about the dreadnought, was the king of the sea and whose tactical training and experience had been molded in this tradition. And the battleship isn't going to have as big a role in World War II as the aircraft carrier. Likewise, the air arm had to learn new and dangerous skills, namely taking off and landing from a tiny bobbing speck in the middle of a vast ocean. So you've got a plane and it's got to come in and land, and the boat is moving. And of course, if the waves are going, it might be, moving up and down or side to side. And you've got to be able to land your plane on that deck. And we're going to see how that works. If it's raining or there's weather, they got to turn the boat into the wind to help it get up and off. It's a very limited runway. So it was a whole new training for pilots to be able to master being a Navy pilot that would be on these boats. And of course, they had to navigate to and from targets with very primitive location instruments. They had to really keep track of their fuel consumption because they didn't want to get all the way there and then not have enough fuel to get back to their boat because that meant landing in the middle of the vast ocean and most likely death. They could jump out of their planes. They did have inflatable rafts, but the chance of you getting picked up and all that kind of thing, and it would have just been bad. So you needed to make it back, at least close to your planes. I'm sorry, close to your boat. So even if you had to ditch in the sea, you had a chance of getting picked up by, the aircraft carriers were always surrounded by other boats that were supply boats, battleships, other things that could help if you had to land in the ocean. The effectiveness of the aircraft carrier was demonstrated early in the war with the British Royal Navy. Attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, not Taranto, not Toronto, Canada, but a place in Italy in 1940. Okay, so that's one we don't hear as much about. So that could be a good IA topic, maybe. And the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, of course. From that point, carrier production and tactics evolved quickly. An aircraft carrier was only effective as its aircraft, right? You had to have good planes. The Japanese started the war with one of the best carrier borne, meaning an airplane that would be on an aircraft carrier of the war, made by the company Mitsubishi, which you guys all know, and it was nicknamed the Zero. Okay, very famous nickname um, of that plane. By 1942, the U.S. Navy had the Grumman Hellcat, which was itself an excellent fighter for being on aircraft carriers. I think they also had the Mustang. The the British had the Spitfire, although those were land-based, etc. So there's all these different nicknames for all the different airplanes. Throughout the war, most nations created smaller aircraft carriers, escort carriers designed to protect invasion forces and be generally more maneuverable. Some of these aircraft carriers, like the Yorktown and some of the ones that the Japanese had, they were huge, huge boats, right? Because they needed a long landing strip and they wanted a big belly to store all the different airplanes in. And so it's very hard to steer a boat like that in any quick way, right? You know, it takes a while for that boat to make a turn. And so they did make some smaller aircraft carriers. The increased importance of aircraft carriers placed a greater emphasis on their protection. Fleet carriers were accompanied by a wide range of escort vessels and were armed with the latest in anti-aircraft weapons, you know, guns that could shoot up and attack planes that as they flew in to keep attacking planes away. Inventions such as the proximity fuse, which detonated an anti-aircraft shell when it was near an airplane rather than requiring a direct hit, improved aircraft carrier defenses immensely. So really quickly, that means that they would shoot this explosive up into the air, and it wouldn't blow. It didn't necessarily have to even hit the airplane as it was flying toward the ship. It could just explode because the fuse had a timer on it, like wait 8 seconds and then blow up. And all the shrapnel and everything and smoke would be in the air, and it could affect the way the plane uh, would be able to get through that. And that was almost as good as a direct, you know, hitting them with the bullets from your gun on the boat. Okay, and that's it. That's 211, and that is a good way to end. And so then we jump into 7.4. Now, 7.4 is pretty big. Well, it's not so big. Maybe I can do it in one video. And then yeah, we're almost done. And then 7.5. So we'll stop there. Okay. Oop. Okay. Thank you for watching another episode. Well, it's an episode. That makes it sound like an entertainment program. Another video, we'll call it that. And yeah, we'll jump into 7.4. Maybe next weekend I'll have some time to make that one. And I hope this is helping supplement your studies as we go along. And we're almost finished. We got about another 15 pages, and then we jump into our next textbook, right? Okay, thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Peace.